I'm Ben Max, Executive Editor of Gotham Gazette.
And I'm Jarrett Murphy, Executive Editor of City Limits.
Gotham Gazette and City Limits are partnering on Agenda 2019, a project to set the stage for what promises to be a transformational and controversial year at the city and state levels of government in New York.
We are exploring many of the major political dynamics and policy issues that will be on the table in the year ahead, starting with the fact that Democrats will have complete control of state government in New York, creating a new opportunity for the party to move a long list of legislation on everything from voting reform to abortion protections, to gun control, to rent regulations, to environmental policy, and more.
With Manhattan Neighborhood Network, we're bringing you a short series of discussions as part of Agenda 2019, including one today, which will focus on the topic of housing and the key political, policy, and budget decisions that will, or at least should be, discussed in 2019 in New York City and Albany. Joining us to discuss everything from the city's public housing to rent regulations that are decided in Albany and beyond are Emily Goldstein, Director of Organizing and Advocacy at the Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development, and Delsenia Glover, Executive Director of Tenants and Neighbors. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Before we get into that long list of policy topics, or at least some of them, let's find out who's at the table. Delsenia, tell us about your organization.
My organization is New York State Tenants and Neighbors, which we call Tenants and Neighbors for short. We've been around since 1974, and our mission is preservation of affordable housing and communities. And we do that by organizing at the ground level. We do building organizing, community organizing, and we do partnerships and alliances with other organizations in the city that have the same mission.
And Emily?
And ANHD is a citywide coalition of about 100 member organizations who work in neighborhoods throughout New York City to build thriving communities, particularly in low and moderate income neighborhoods, working on issues of affordable housing as well as equitable economic development.
And so we know that ANHD has more of a focus in the city, Tenants and Neighbors more of a focus on the state, although obviously your tenants are mostly in New York City, but you're focused on a lot of state regulations, and that will be key to the 2019 discussion. So why don't we start there?
Absolutely.
Rent regulations. What are you looking at in 2019?
Well, we're looking in 2019, in addition to fixing the rent laws, fixing the loopholes in the rent laws, we're also in conjunction with an alliance of organizations across the city and across the state looking at expanding rent control across the state. We're focused on universal rent control. On the rent regulations front, we are focused again this year, as we've been doing for many, many years, on fixing loopholes in the rent laws, which include fixing MCIs, which includes vacancy deregulation, which includes preferential rents, and which includes the vacancy bonus. And I can break each of those down if you want as we go through the discussion. But those are the four pieces that we are most focused on as far as fixing rent regulation, because those are the drivers of rent increases and the drivers of deregulation as a whole.
And we're talking rent regulations, we're talking about roughly 1 million apartments in New York City?
Roughly 1 million apartments.
That these regulations apply to.
That these regulations apply to. Primarily, it's rent stabilized, and then there's a small quantity, about 26,000 units in the rent regulation system that are rent control, and they have some differences in how increases are calculated for rent.
And so these regulations that are decided in Albany, although there's some discussion about whether they should be decided in Albany or...
I mean, they're decided in Albany, and, maybe they should be in the city, but wherever the legislators control it, the real estate industry will be throwing money at them, whether it's city or state. So I don't know if it makes much of a difference. But what we're optimistic about is that the Democrats have taken control of the Senate, because for far too many years, all of our bills, would be passed in the New York State Assembly and then get to the Senate and hit a wall. So we are very optimistic that some really good things will happen for tenants and neighborhoods this legislative session coming up.
Emily, why don't you jump in? Talk about NHD's agenda in Albany and City Hall on the legislative or policy front. What's the top of your list?
Sure. So in Albany, our agenda is Delsenia's agenda. It's the same agenda, and it's really important. I think there is an important opportunity, and I will say I think the fact that these laws, for better or for worse, are controlled in Albany, creates an opportunity to recognize that the affordability crisis is not actually only happening in New York City, it really is statewide. And if we're talking about state legislation, let's think about homelessness, and let's think about displacement, and let's think about affordability everywhere, even though that's not where we tend to, ANHD, focus. In terms of the city policy and thinking about the city, one of our big areas of focus has been and will continue to be land use policy and rezonings. Obviously, there's been a lot of neighborhood rezonings. There's been a lot of controversy about them. Quite a few of them have gone through now. And so I think it's time to step back and reassess how is the city's land use policy either helping or hurting the overall goals of promoting affordability and promoting stable and thriving neighborhoods. And we would argue that by and large, the city's tending to do more harm than good in terms of how they move rezonings and how they think about land use policy, often sort of separated from broader goals of affordability and separated from really assessing the impacts of the changes that they're making. Tied to that is looking at overall the Housing New York, right, the mayor's housing plan, and one of our big concerns with it from the get-go has been that there's such a big focus on unit count. There's such a big focus on counting the number of units created or preserved.
300,000.
It was 200,000. Now
right?
it's 300,000, right? And there's not a lot of looking at whether hitting those unit counts is actually reducing homelessness or reducing rent burden or preventing displacement or preventing evictions, or right, like translating into what might be better measures of actually thinking about whether we're making a dent in the affordability crisis. And in some cases, that drive towards unit count, right, which is part of what we see in how they then move their land use policy and move these upzonings to allow for more development, often is potentially having the opposite effect, right, and driving displacement and leading to an overall reduction in affordability, even as the unit count ticks up.
So I think we're going to come back to the mayor's housing plan in a minute, but sticking with rent regulations for a moment, and either of you please jump in, just a little bit more on some of the specifics there. I mean,
Sure.
what are we really talking about when we talk about MCI, major capital improvements and some of those terms?
So a major capital improvement is when a building owner makes an improvement in one of the structural systems, as it should be, rather than cosmetic, one of the structural systems in the building. It could be a new roof, it could be a new boiler, it could be rewiring the electrical systems, it could be putting in new elevators. And the law allows the owner of the building to add a portion of the cost of the renovation to tenants' rent. They are allowed to add, I think, 1/40 of the cost to and spread it amongst the tenants. And so sometimes if it's a boiler and it's a really large building, it may be $1. But sometimes if it's like new windows, for example, it could be $15 per room per unit, which can add a substantial increase to rent for apartments that are supposed to be affordable in conjunction with the New York City rent guidelines increases. One of the biggest drivers of rent acceleration in this city right now is something called the vacancy bonus. And the vacancy bonus is when a tenant moves out of a rent-regulated unit or passes away or whatever, exits the unit, the landlord can get a 20% bonus or 20% uptick in rent, whether they do renovations or not. They just do broom sweep, they get 20%.
For the next tenant, they're allowed to raise those.
And they raise the rent 20%. And if the tenant has been in the apartment for a very long time, there's also varying increases that can be added on for longevity of the previous tenant. On top of that, they do what's called an individual apartment improvement increase, where they can put in all sorts of grand structures and granite countertops or whatever it is they want to do, and a portion of that is added to the rent also. So an apartment that was renting for $900 a month can effectively go up to $1,500 a month after you add on all of the increases that a landlord can charge. And this is done deliberately and it was put into the law deliberately so that landlords can reap profits, but also so that the rent can be driven closer and closer to the deregulation limit over a few turnovers.
And so with those, are you looking to eliminate those features of the law, to tweak them? And some of them have been tweaked in recent years. The threshold for decontrol has been
That's the only thing that's been tweaked, really.
Is that what you're looking for adjustments, or to eliminate those as part of the law?
Well, I think that the vacancy bonus, because it's given for absolutely nothing, I think that can be eliminated. It probably won't happen, but if they could just come up with, there are different formulas that can be used so that if a person has been in the apartment personally, I think that it should be gone, okay?
Right.
But being a realistic person, I think that there can be some adjustments to it, but what we want is for the vacancy bonus to be totally eliminated, because it does nothing. It gives nothing to the next tenant. It's just to line landlords' pockets and drive us further toward the deregulation threshold. So we want the vacancy bonus gone.
Either you or both you could weigh in on this. What landlords say, as you well know, is that rent regulation is a poorly targeted tool for affordable housing because it's not means tested, right? I mean, to afford rents near the threshold for deregulation, you have to be fairly comfortable. Is there any merit to that argument, that it's not really a tool solely for affordable housing?
I would say that's, on some level, that's true, and I don't think it's a problem, because the purpose of rent stabilization is to counter the fact that New York City's housing market is insane, right? And that there is limited, right? If the vacancy rate in New York City ever hits, I think it's 5%, the whole system would be gone, and we don't even worry about that because we've never even come close to it, right? Like, this system has been in effect for so long because the vacancy rate in New York City is so low that the dynamics of negotiation and the sort of dynamics of need for housing on the part of tenants, regardless of income for a second, right, versus the dynamics on the part of landlords who have units to rent out are completely out of whack, right? There's no give and take there. There's no equality of bargaining. Rent stabilization comes in to say, oh, if there's no supply and there's inherent demand because people need a place to live, right, then the market doesn't really work, and we have to regulate the market, and we have to do something about the fact that when the vacancy rate is so low, landlords have sort of such outsized power. And that's the purpose of the program. It does overall tend to serve lower income people, people of color, immigrant families, like to a larger degree than disproportionately to the population, right? The people who need affordable housing actually are being able to access this affordable housing, but it's not serving the same purpose as a means-tested program, and there's value in that.
But to your point, the rents that are being charged currently, especially for new constructed rent-regulated apartments, is so high that it cannot be considered affordable when you look at the income levels for the communities where these apartments are being constructed. And this is why we focus on things like MCIs and the vacancy bonus, because these are the drivers of escalating rents. And when the apartment continues to turn over and a 20% vacancy bonus is given to the landlord each time, eventually those apartments are out of the reach of poor, working class, and moderate income people in this city.
Your point goes back to some of what Emily was saying about the mayor's housing plan and where some of those levels get set in terms of what in new construction the rents get set up, and your focus, of course, on the preservation aspect, where these regulations come into play much sooner than some of these buildings that'll be built down the line.
That's right.
Isn't some of this an argument for building a lot more housing with much of it or some of it being affordable, but given the low vacancy rates, there's a need for a lot more housing in New York City?
There's a need for a lot more housing that is affordable for the people who live in the communities where housing is being constructed. That the housing that needs to be constructed in these communities, like where I live, which is Central Harlem, should be 100% affordable. When you put a building that is 80% luxury or market and 20% so-called affordable, this is a gentrification tool. And what it causes is it causes all costs for everything in that community to escalate. And this is what gentrification is. We think that the mayor's plan to create more affordable housing in isolation is a good thing, but the way it's being done is causing a gentrification process in all of these communities that is absolutely inevitable if this is the kind of housing that you build.
Overall, do you think the mayor's plan has done more harm than good?
I mean, I think that's really hard to evaluate, and part of why it's hard to evaluate is that there's not a clear assessment of need, goals, and impact in relation to each other, right? So there are aspects of the mayor's plan, right? There has been an aspect of the plan that's been a focus on preservation of expiring use, affordable units, and we fully support that and think that's incredibly important.
Right.
The aspect of the plan that's build a ton more and a little bit is going to be affordable, usually not for the income levels that really need it, is doing more harm than good, I would say. And I think to Delsenia's point, which I completely agree with, and in answer to your question, we have to distinguish between building housing and building affordable housing. And I think that there is a tendency in public dialogue to allow those two to conflate and become murky, and there's actually a huge difference. And when we conflate them, we sort of get into what essentially is a theory of trickle down, right? That if we build enough housing regardless of the income level, which is going to mean luxury housing, that eventually the benefits of that are going to trickle down. And what we've seen is that that's not the case, right? The affordability crisis is getting worse and worse, despite the fact that over the last number of years, on average, we've built like 20,000 more units, right? Like the city is building. There is more housing being constructed. A lot of that luxury housing is now sitting vacant, right? Because there's not enough rich people to live in it, and yet that's still what's getting built, and the affordability crisis hasn't been resolved.
But is 80-20 or 75-25 really trickle down? I mean, that it's not just saying 100% market rate and then that'll work out for other people because it opens up other affordable housing. I mean, it is baked in. I mean, that was the whole principle behind mandatory inclusionary housing, right?
It was, but you have the balance and the levels of affordability matter, right? So 50-50 and 80-20 are different, right? And where exactly is the right balance between market rate and affordable in terms of what are the displacement and gentrification impacts of the market rate side versus the potential, right, good affordability provision impacts of the affordable side matter. What also matters is how affordable are those affordable units. And to what Delsenia was saying earlier, if the affordable units are being built in a community where most of the people in that community make half as much as they would need to even access those affordable units, then those are also having a gentrification impact, not a sort of affordability stabilization impact.
And it's driving people out of the communities, and it's also driving people out of their homes. I have a radio show that I do on Monday nights, and last night I had a conversation with Mo George. She's the executive director of Picture the Homeless, and we were talking about the fact that the homelessness crisis has grown about the number of homeless people has increased about 37% in New York City over the past 10 years. And a lot of the reason why that's happening is not because there's a housing crisis, it's because there's an affordability crisis. Everyone who's homeless is not a person who has a mental disease and they're roaming the street. They're people who were living in affordable housing, a lot of them, and it just became too expensive for them to stay there, and they're now in shelters. So in order to fix that and the numbers are going, so in order to fix that problem, you don't fix that problem by building a building in the middle of a neighborhood like Central Harlem that is 80% luxury and 20% so-called affordable, where the rent to come in is $2,200 a month.
No, that sounds like the crux of the issue is if there's affordable, what are the affordable
exactly,
levels?
and just on the ground, just anecdotally, I mean, I know people personally, and Emily probably does also, who have moved out of neighborhoods that are supposed to be affordable to upstate New York, across the river to New Jersey, and they are commuting 2 hours in the morning or 3 hours in the morning to get to a job in the city because they cannot live in the city where they've been for their whole lives and pay rent.
We have a couple rezonings coming up, or potentially coming to the table in 2019, and there's the chance that they might be more significantly shaped by community input of one form or another than some of the past ones, so Bushwick, Gowanus. Is there any hope that those are going to look more like the kind of rezonings, if any, that affordable housing communities need than the ones we've seen previously, East New York, East Harlem?
I mean, I hope so, right? So I think Bushwick is a really interesting example to keep our eyes on because it is really a community-led effort to say what would be, right? This is an already gentrifying neighborhood with a lot of specific quirks, right? Every neighborhood has quirks, right? But in particular in Bushwick, a lot of the housing is unregulated. And so people have even less protection than in rent stabilization. And there's been a years-long process, an enormous effort by a lot of community stakeholders to figure out what would be, and the criteria they used was what would be a plan that means that the affordability sort of balance, both in terms of depth of affordability, how low income are you reaching, and overall numbers versus market rate, would be better with a new plan than under the status quo of just leaving things as they are. Like that was their baseline, and they have come up with a proposal that they believe, and we've provided some technical assistance there, I believe, would do that. We'll see, I mean, if the city were to actually take that plan and move it as is, right, intact and maintaining that principle, I actually think that would be very different from the other rezonings we've had. And the question remains, will the city sort of respect that goal and that baseline and take this plan that the community worked so hard on and move it, or will they sort of cherry pick a piece of it and ignore how the pieces fit together?
Connect these parts of the conversation. If more affordable housing being built is a big goal, and you talk about having the opportunity in some of these rezonings, but 80-20 doesn't work, even if the 20 is more affordable, is more deeply affordable, the rents are set. How does building more affordable housing work? How does it actually happen?
So I would say the first principle has to be preserve existing affordability. And that comes in many forms, and that relates to many policies, right? That relates to expanding protections in Albany so that unregulated tenants actually have some protections, right? That can go in a lot of different directions. But it's like a first do no harm, like that medical principle, right? In addition and alongside that, I think is assessing the actual affordability, who in a community and in the city as a whole is in need of affordability right now, right? Who is doubled up, who is becoming homeless, right? What are the income levels where more housing actually needs to be created? And then how can we thoughtfully create that housing in a way that doesn't undercut the first do no harm principle that we started with?
And is it that affordable housing developers need to basically be the main focus, where it's flipped, or it's 100? There's not that many units being built, but it's 100% affordable buildings, or?
I think some of it is looking for where there are opportunities to actually do 100% affordable and to really control the terms. So what are we doing with public land, and how can we really take advantage of the amount of control the city has over what happens to public land? I think some of it is how do we right? There is on some level a trade-off between number of units and depth of affordability in units. I think that trade-off needs to shift more towards depth of affordability. And if that means fewer units, then so be it. But if that's the way we're going to get to serve the income population that needs it, then that shifts in how the city is distributing its subsidy. And I do think there's an aspect here about who is doing the development in the first place. There are nonprofit, mission-driven developers in every community of this city that are actually not trying to make profits off of these public programs. They're embedded in the community, and they're trying to use as good a tool as the city and the state can provide to provide maximum affordability for their community. And then there's a lot of developers who are providing the minimum affordability required by a program and making profits off of essentially tax dollars, right? And I think the shift of how many resources and how much development is being done by mission-driven developers versus by for-profits really needs to change.
We have just a few seconds left. I wanted to ask, back to the Albany issue. Democrats are in charge. What's your level of confidence? Do you trust the Senate Democrats? Do you trust Governor Cuomo to deliver? How optimistic are you?
Well, I don't trust Governor Cuomo to deliver, but I do have some confidence in the Senate Democrats forcing him to get on board looking at the big picture. I don't get into a lot of political talk because that's not what we do. But I think that, we're in conversations with our elected officials all of the time. I think that most of the folks who we talk to, they understand that we are in a crisis situation, and that if something's not done in 2019, we will continue to lose the number of rent-regulated units that we have, which is the largest source of affordable housing for New Yorkers, and we need to preserve that. So I think that we have some confidence, and we also have confidence. Our confidence is not in elected officials. Our confidence is in our power as tenants and as citizens to make things happen.
Okay, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. There are about 15 things on our list here we didn't get to, but that's part of what we're doing with Agenda 2019, so we'll be going into a lot more detail about, you mentioned something like extending rent protections to currently unregulated units, and we didn't get too deep into that conversation, or the crisis at the city's public housing, but there's a lot more to discuss other times, so thank you both for being here very much.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for watching Agenda 2019 on Manhattan Neighborhood Network.
For more on this series, you can visit GothamGazette.com or citylimits.org. If you're a tenant suffering from a heat, hot water, electricity, or gas outage, we're tracking them at City Limits. Text outage to 646-916-3930.
And the next part in this series will be on voting reform and campaign finance reform. From the Manhattan Neighborhood Network studios, I'm Ben Max.
And I'm Jarrett Murphy.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.